Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I am your host, Pavini Moray. Wanting to give a shout out to Richard in the UK. Thank you for the podcast love. It's really great to hear from you and hear your suggestions. And just want to encourage everyone that if you have thoughts or questions or suggestions, stuff you'd like to hear on the podcast, please be in touch. It's really helpful for me to hear about it. And then I can make the podcast the place that you want to be spending your free time. So yeah, you can reach out to me on the Bespoken Bones website or on transastralhealing.com. And just also excited to share that Taya Shear and I are going to be offering an ancestral lineage healing intensive in Berkeley, California, November 30th to December 2nd. It's 3 days of ritual and transgenerational healing, working with your well, bright ancestors to bring blessing and healing down your bloodlines to you. Really good for folks who are adopted, good for folks who have tough relationships with their families, to really root into that resource of ancestral guidance and blessing. And we all have awesome ancestors. They might be a little bit far back in our bloodlines, but they're definitely there. So today, really special interview for you. Naomi Ortiz is going to be on Bespoken Bones, and Naomi is a facilitator, a writer, poet, and a visual artist who cracks apart common beliefs and spills out beauty. Naomi is a nationally known writer, speaker, and trainer on self-care, disability justice, and living in multiple worlds, which is what she calls, that's how she says intersectionality, is living in multiple worlds. She is a disabled, Mestiza, Latina, Indigenous white, raised in Latinx culture, living in the U.S., Mexico borderlands. Naomi's book, Sustaining Spirit, Self-Care for Social Justice, invites readers to delve into what self-care means in their lives by exploring the relationships between body, mind, spirit, heart, and place to integrate self-care to survive and thrive. Caring about the world should not burn us out. And her book, Sustaining Spirit, Self-Care for Social Justice, shows us how to balance activism and self-care. And so for more information on Naomi's work, on speaking and workshops, you can visit www.naomiortiz.com. I'll spell it. It's NaomiOrtiz.com. You can find her on Twitter at thinkfreestyle and on Instagram at Naomi Ortiz, writer, artist. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I am so grateful that you're here and really excited about our conversation today. And just want to make a little bit of space right out of the gate to invite any well and bright activist ancestors that you would like to honor in our work today.
Oh, there's so many. I'd like to really honor Gloria Anzaldúa. She actually never identified explicitly as disabled and was, as a lot of our ancestors, were in their human process of coming to understanding and recognition of who they are. And she talked a lot about living in multiple worlds in the borderlands and really, really crafted a home for me when I found her work. And also Harriet McBride Johnson. She's a disabled activist who just was super sassy and lovely. So I'd like to call them in for this.
So that seems like a great place to start. Let's just start there with talking about disability and spirituality. Because I know you think a lot about those things and you have a lot to say.
Yeah, I don't know, if I can speak for all disabled folks. in terms of spirituality, but I do know that there are some commonalities that a lot of us have in terms of deepening into and being more aware of kind of the minutia, like the stuff around us on the day to day. Mostly because pretty much all of us, whether you have psych disability or intellectual disability or physical disability or neurodiversity disability, a lot of us go slower for different reasons and in different ways. So to me, that's actually a really beautiful opportunity to notice more about like what's going on around you or the folks that you're in community with. And I think that that really leads to some levels of maybe deepening spirituality for those of us who are interested in that. Um, it creates like a deeper opportunity in a way that's semi unexpected. It's not like your typical go on retreat and do 5 mile hikes. It's like, let's go sit and let's go listen and let's just like be in a space and see what we see. And I think that's a different way of being in relationship with the world that can open things to a deeper level of spirituality.
Do you think that, like, I think a lot about trans magic, right? And the experience of being gender liminal. And my guess is, I mean, that's obviously really deeply rooted in the body, right? And the gifts of that. I mean, and of course, there's lots of cultural burdens that come with that. Yeah. But there's also like these amazing gifts that at least I get, and other folks who I know who have, gender blessings get. And I'm just guessing that there's something like there's a similar magic here in living in a body that has disabilities. I mean, we all have disabilities, but I think you're talking about a really specific way of being in a body, and or many specific ways of being in bodies. Sorry. And yeah, could you just speak a little bit to that? Like maybe even on a personal level of like, is there magic, blessings, gifts that you have because of the body that you have?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm talking about disability as in like a social political identity, which is a little bit different. I mean, I think everybody has things that they can and can't do. And obvious, limitations because we're all human. But disability is kind of a different level of that in terms of the interaction with the world and also our interaction and relationship with ourselves. It takes a lot of creativity and I would say, asking for help, things that are challenging, I think, for all humans, at least maybe in the Western Western world, to like ask for help and to be in relationship with other people in a way where you are going to be asking for help. But I think for me personally, definitely levels of magic in terms of being disabled and what that means through my work and how I show up in the world. And sometimes that means that I don't have as much community as I'd like because I'm not able to access spaces. Sometimes that means my world's smaller sometimes. It can feel like that. And the worlds that I get to enter in a really deep and rich way. So for me, like what I was saying before, I think being able to go slower, if I'm, out in nature and I get a chance to like, I can walk about, let's say 25 feet down a path. And then I bring my little chair and I sit down. And then I'm like deeply intimate with that patch of ground that I'm sitting at, where if I did, 2-hour hike or whatever, it would be a really different experience. I may not be in relationship with what I'm around as deeply.
So there's like a quality of how you bring your attention that is deeper, that it feels like it's on a deeper level. Yeah.
Yeah. And it has to be more intentional. I mean, I know folks who use PAs or who use which are people who support folks to like shower and get dressed and things, daily living stuff, have to spend a lot of energy and, the gifts of being in deep relationship with people who are supporting you to get ready. It's a lot of extension. And so for me, that really led to a lot of what I ended up writing about around self-care was like, if we're it requires kind of also this intense extension into the world in order to survive. So it's like, how do we nourish ourselves and also replenish in ways that, fuel us to be able to like also have joy and be able to enjoy things and not just be focused solely on this extension.
Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by extension? Because I think I understand, but I just want to be really clear.
Yeah, thank you. So, like if I'm going to go to a space, let's say to go see a poetry reading, it's like all the things that are entailed in that for me. It's like, do I feel up to driving myself? Where can I find parking? Is the parking close enough to the space? When I get into the space, are there going to be chairs? Will I get stepped on? Is it going to be really crowded? It's like the level of planning and kind of, that's actually like definitely a component, I think, of disability culture is like this hypersensitivity and hyper awareness of like needing to plan. And have like support systems in place to kind of negotiate spaces where we're often not expected. And so that's what I mean by extension, just like a lot of energy going out and not a lot often coming in.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's helpful, and it also, the image that I got when you were talking about it, it was like that there's a quality of time magic here. Right? If you're really having to, it's like you're having to be in the present, vision into the future, know what's going to be needed, and kind of prepare for those eventualities in a really particular way. That and just that commitment to doing that for the sake of pleasure. It's beautiful.
Yeah. I love that framing of it. Actually, that's great.
I want to just say that I identify as an activist, but I didn't always identify as an activist. And there was a moment of, I don't know, really coming into that identity of like, oh, this is like I was doing the same work in the world. It wasn't like it changed, but like there was like a moment of like really putting on that identity of like, oh yeah, like this is activism. And I'm doing this for the sake of this world that I want to live in. Right. And I know that you have moved through many activist communities, and social justice is like a part of it's. I mean, it just seems like a big part of your heart is really contributing to this world, co-creating this world that would be just for every being. And I think sometimes, at least in my experience of activism, sometimes we lose the forest for the trees of like, what exactly is that just world, that just culture that we're really trying to bring into being. And I wonder if you have any wisdom to share on that, of like when you feel into that, when you drop out of kind of like the thinking academic self and into the feeling self of like, what does that world feel like?
Well, growing up, so I live in Tucson, which is about 50 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. And growing up, they call them semi, but they're permanent checkpoints that we go through every time we're on those roads. So that was like an experience of growing up, was like going through these checkpoints every week to go see family or friends in different areas. And I think that what struck me as a kid was just like the intense feeling of going through that checkpoint and having on the U.S. side of the line. So I'm not talking about the border itself, but on the U.S. side, there's checkpoints just for people that we all have to go through. So as a kid going through those, it's like there was like always this really intense tension in my panza, my stomach, my chest, my throat. I was so aware of the tension that not only I felt as a child, but also the people around me felt in going through those. And I think that was like one of my first experiences of this isn't right, besides kind of like the personal experience of medical intervention. In terms of disability. But, I had really mixed messages with that. Like lots of people were telling me, oh, no, this is good for you. So that's like a different experience. Like this was a more universal experience where I felt like a community kind of body feeling in my body of this not being right. And so I think that activism is often us grappling with this tension of like what doesn't feel right in our bodies, and then how we can support ourselves and other people to feel better, to feel seen, to be more in touch with their truth. And then the tension of also like, how do we be responsible to each other when our truths are different? Um, I mean, I think what I love about activism so much is that it's really messy. There's, you know, I always am attracted to the super messy stuff. I'm like, ooh, how's that happen? What's that work? So I think that, and I think a lot of us are, and I think that's actually incredible that a lot of us, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are like super attracted to this messiness, because it's like, this is the human condition. This is the condition of living in community. And I really think activism, when you get down to it, is really about how do we live in community with each other and not squash each other, like see each other, honor each other.
Yeah, that feels right to me too. It's like how can me doing what I want and what makes me happy not interfere with you doing what you want and what makes you happy, right? And how can we really hold it like that? I was thinking about that. I don't think in the West we have this shared value of the goodness of the whole, right? I think that's a more Indigenous value when I think about like the goodness of the whole.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that there are lots of cultural communities who honor and connect to a feeling of integrity when it comes to this idea of taking care of each other. Like I was definitely raised that way, like that it was my responsibility to take care of other people. And that was something we all shared. But because there's just like the human nature to things, it gets messy there too. So I don't know if there's like really, one perfect way to come at this. And I actually think that that's what makes it so beautiful, is that there are lots of different ways to talk about and think about being responsible to each other and being in community.
Yeah, I like that. It's like, I just had a moment where I was like, oh shit, my trauma's showing.
I honor that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about place. You write, I'm going to quote you, "We often come to the work of social justice from a place of deep wounding where we have witnessed or experienced the harm of injustice." And you continue to say that the only place for our wounding is in the dirt beneath our feet. And I'm just curious about how that sense of place and the dirt under our feet can really support our healing and our wellness.
So, when I was a kid, I would play in the desert behind the apartment complex that we lived in. And to me, it was like the dirt and the rocks and the plants always felt so interconnected and alive. I live in the Sonoran Desert, it's just lush with different kinds of cactus and desert trees. And much of the area around Tucson is, I don't know if there's what the proper word is, but it's like old growth. It hasn't been, impacted by humans in the sense of like wiping it away and building on it and then it growing back in some frame. Like it's been there, it's old growth. So I think it really models the kind of diversity it takes for survival. And that's one of the things I just was always in awe of, is like, how do these things that don't look like they could live together and survive, especially in this environment, do it? And so it's like, that's, I think, part of why a lot of us who live here, it's like one of the things we want to learn is like, how does survival work? And so, growing up, I like went into the desert a lot. And there was this one time when I went into the desert and I had just like reached my limit. I was heartbroken and angry, and I just fled to one of my favorite spots. And I found myself on a rock next to a creosote bush and an ironwood tree. And both of those lived for hundreds of years. And I started talking to them, and I was just begging for perspective. And it occurred to me that these two very different plants had a relationship that was older than my great grandparents, like just by growing next to each other. And it made me really deepen and appreciate what the land could offer, just because it actually has so much more wisdom than I do, than, people who are alive in my family maybe have access to. So I think that the place for me is oftentimes something that I can brace against when I feel very alone and disconnected from community. And that to me is an unbelievably precious gift, because I want to rely on other people. I mean, who doesn't want to have somebody else be like, oh, here's the exact thing you should do, or here's my exact, beautiful insight for you. And then everything clears away and you're like, oh, and that's amazing. And there's these lovely moments where that actually happens with other people. But most often, people are complicated and there's a lot going on. And so it's where do we find nourishment and connection and support if we can't connect to place and the ancestors, I think, too. It's both of those are available, and sort of in a really different way than people are. And being able to connect with dirt and plants that are hundreds of years older than I am is such a privilege, and something that I just am so grateful to be able to brace against, and something that I think we all have access to, even if it's in very different ways. I was giving a talk in Detroit, and I was talking to folks there, and I was like, there's this beautiful grass you have outside, everywhere, growing out of the cracks in the street, There's the sky. There's so much access to nature that we can sit and pause with and brace against.
Yeah, I feel it when it's too much, when it feels like too much, that there's this way of letting the natural world, letting it hold me, letting life hold me. I'm thinking of a moment that I had some time ago of just being in deep grief and kind of traumatic grief, and going out to the Pacific Ocean and laying in the sand and listening to the wind and the sound of the water, and the air just touching my skin was just about all I could handle,
Mm-hmm.
But it was also oh, here's something that's big enough to hold this grief that I'm feeling, right? Here's something that I don't have to hold it inside my body. I don't have to contain it here. I can allow life to hold it with me. And in doing so, receive the gift back of being held, right?
Mm.
And I think when I read that, what you wrote, that was what I thought about. Wasn't oh, I'm gonna dump my wounding into the ground, but I think what you're talking about is a reciprocal relationship, right, where we're both giving and receiving, and kind of participating fully in life, right?
Absolutely. There's a chapter that I wrote in the book, actually, about grief, that that essentially is connected to what you were talking about. And I think I'm so grateful. I mean, so deeply grateful that there's something that exists, that sometimes I feel like my emotions are so big, and my pain or my grief or my anger is so big that it's going to hurt, what's around me. And I am so incredibly grateful that there are places that I can go and rocks that I can lean on, that it doesn't hurt them. Whatever I'm feeling, whatever it's I'm not too much for the land, for the place that I live. And that's an incredible gift that I'm just so grateful to have, and that we all have access to, and for free. Yeah, think over that, right?
Yeah, I totally am softening into that, the sense of yes, we're not too much, and that there are we're not toxic, right? And I think just to bring it back to social justice and activism and all that, there's that. I was thinking this morning, I don't know if you saw it a couple years ago, there was this article that was written, or I don't know, somebody's writing about being toxic, and and I had a friend come to me and they were like, Pavini, I think I've been toxic in relationship. And I just really, I found that idea unhelpful, right?
Mm.
Like to imagine that somehow like I am toxic, like I am human, I'm deeply human, and I have all of the tenderness and vulnerability, and I have all the capacity as a human, right? But that doesn't, like, there's nothing like that's somehow, wrong with that. I mean, and I'm making choices, and I can be accountable for my choices and all that. But just that idea of like that there's this, I guess it kind of leads back to like, and maybe we can come to this through a disability lens of like throwaway people, like in activist culture, right? Like if someone missteps, if they, make a mistake, that then there's this shunning, there's this kind of extricating of them from the culture. And I'm imagining that it's, it's just like the ways that we marginalize all people. And so I'm curious about self-care, and like self-care is community care, and how does, like, what are the threads here that we can weave people in rather than push them out without kind of, crossing our own boundaries or doing anything weird like that. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about like, how do we become indispensable to each other? How do we do this thing that you're talking about, this extension, this like vulnerable needing of each other, leaning into the land, to our ancestors, and to each other in service of this world that we're trying to make bearable?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. One part is that, we have to be in a space where we are, I won't say we, I will speak for myself. I have to be in a space that I am grounded and, I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to be grounded and open and receptive and, my best self all the time. But if I am doing the different kinds of self-care, and then I have that capacity to be more flexible to things that make me uncomfortable. So there's actually lots of different kinds of self-care. There's body self-care, which I feel like, at least what I see in the media, that's oftentimes what people are talking about, which is like exercise, your bubble baths, pampering, high value food, those kinds of things, which is definitely self-care. It's just one type. There's spiritual self-care, which includes like religious practices, meditation, being in nature. There's what I call nourishing self-care, which is like creative expression, gathering inspiration. Mind self-care, which is learning and feeling valued and skill building. There's transformative experiences, which I think is especially important for folks who identify as social justice activists, which includes spiritual deepening, building intuition, and doing deep emotional work. There's emotional self-care, which is self-expression, feeling feelings, accessing relationships. And then there's being aware of our reality, which is changing perspective. And I actually include that as a type of self-care because I think it's it includes some discomfort, and it also includes, it builds our capacity. It like lets us trust our own resiliency so that when we are around other people or situations that make us uncomfortable, we know we have the capacity to be there. We know we have that ability to be there. So I think that is like, we have to be ready. We have to do our own work in a way in order to be in community and in the best spaces with other people. And then I really think in interconnecting with other people, it's like, how do we expect difference? And this is something that I've been talking a lot about in groups that I work with, is that especially in something that really comes to me out of disability community. When I go into disability community, and that's sort of framed for me, I go in expecting everybody to be very different from me, not just like with their cultures, which of course is true, and their backgrounds, which of course is true, but also in the way that they actually function. So that expectation of difference puts me in a space of like expecting to be flexible, expecting to like respond to what people say they need, and also expecting myself to give voice to what I need in that situation, which is really different if you think about it than how we often are in social spaces, like going into social spaces, we're often in, uh, more like wanting to connect to people, at least for I am. And, I oftentimes don't think so much about my responsibility to the people that I'm entering into space with. So I think those are like super important components in terms of just being truthful people with each other, being humans with other humans, basically.
Yeah, it makes me happy to hear that list. I read that in your book also, and like especially the part about like knowing what our reality is. For me, that's kind of the practice of naming what is, and it's so profound.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's such a profound practice to just be like, well, that is like, I might not like it. I might be really angry about that. I might really feel uncomfortable with that, but that is.
Oh, yeah. It's like what I resist the most. After doing this work all these years, it's still like, oh man, you're saying I just have to accept it, don't I? I just have to like acknowledge that this is what is. Okay. Doesn't mean it has to stay like this, but this is what is. All right, fine,
Right. And until we get there, it's like we can't go anywhere until we're there. Right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was kind of a complicated question that I was like unwinding as I was asking it. So thanks for your patience with that one. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about being mestiza and like how that works with the ancestral stuff. Like how does having multiple racial identities embodied, how do you work with that in terms of social justice, but also just like in terms of like, I imagine that your people might have really radically different desires, needs, ways they communicate, things they want you to do. Yeah, I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Definitely. Yeah. So yeah, I think, growing up, I was always really aware of my cultural backgrounds, the lineages that I come from, but it's like I would say actually, especially when I got involved in social justice work, which was pretty young. I started doing prison work when I was 18, facilitating workshops in prisons and um, connecting with folks doing activism around restorative justice and stuff. And and uh, that was like I think one of the very first times that I heard that like you have to choose. You have to choose what cultural identity that you come from. And one of the privileges I'm so grateful actually with being raised here on the border is that there's a lot of mixed folks and, in different ways. And there's just like more kind of, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I feel like there is more kind of acceptance that and tolerance, maybe of toleration of like coming at it and being like, yeah, I'm all these things and these things are all me equally. Um, but one of the things, so when I felt a lot of pressure to pick one, it really forced me into challenging myself about like, well, should I pick one? I could technically, I'm more of, like I have two grandparents from Mexico. So should I be picking that, should that be my thing? Should it, it's like, and so it's like, it led me into really dissecting all these components of who I am. And it was just it was horrible. I just felt so lost for a long time in terms of like how to recognize and honor all these pieces of myself. And then there's an additional layer of being disabled, which didn't fit in any of my cultural identities. Like none of my cultural communities deal well with disability. They have some things they do okay on and other things that they do horrible at. They're often different. So that's like an additional layer. It's like, even if I did pick one, I still don't fit, So that's actually really how I started developing relationship with ancestors for me. And that was my connection to ancestors. It was like, there's a lot of my family lineage that I don't know that was lost because of forced migration, cultural decimation. I mean, we've lost so much in terms of our history. But I feel my ancestors, like I feel them in my blood and in my bones. I'm sure, like many of us do, they're there. And, I've listened to other folks on your show and they have like way detailed and intimate relationships with their ancestors, which I think is kind of incredible. I do not have, I feel like, that detailed of a relationship. It's like, for me, there's sort of like this, like in the book, I wrote a chapter about how I view ancestors, and I talk about them like the sky. It's like they exist. I see this big blue dome. They witness like all these things. They witness the storms. They witness everything happening underneath them. And yet at night, this dome disappears. And I know, from science, we know it's just light reflecting. It's there and it's not there. And I feel like that's kind of my relationship with ancestors. It's like I firmly feel connected to them. And I know that it's like so much more complicated than I could ever understand. At least that's my relationship with them. But part of what was really helpful for me to integrate my identities into myself and to identify, and I love that there's a term Mestiza that actually includes all of my cultural identities. A lot of folks don't have that. And it's actually a slur. It's kind of a slur word. Mestiza is, and also why I'm grateful to Gloria Anzaldúa. She really, reclaimed that, started helping reclaim that term. But it was like, I had this period where I spent a lot of time by myself, sort of introducing my ancestors to each other. And it was like sort of a simple process, I guess. Like, these are these people, they come from here. This is like what I know about them. And then, I also did that because I do not live on ancestral land. So I also made these introductions with the ancestors of the land that I live on. So, and that's like the fourth component to my identity, is like the place that I live. And so, being able to introduce whatever capacity and skill I actually had to do that, but my attempt to introduce all of my ancestors to each other, ancestors that often were in conflict when they were alive and cause great harm to each other, feels really good in me. Like, it's almost like it's like an acceptance of what is. It's an acceptance of, okay, all of these tensions live inside of my body, and that's okay. And here I am.
Yeah, I love your answer. I really love it. And it was interesting when you were talking about, like, I don't have these differentiated relationships with my ancestors. It's just kind of like the ancestors, right? I mean, I think that's my sense of like what happens when they're well, right? It stops having to be so differentiated, right? It's not, because I don't have to keep anybody out. I don't have to like just be with the, should choose the good ones, like who are going to be helpful, because they're all good, right? And they're all interwoven in me, in my blood. And so therefore I can, once all of my lineages are well, I can relate to them just as like my ancestors. And it's really nice. It's kind of like the posse,
I think you mentioned this in a previous show, but I deeply believe too that you can heal backwards. And I really think that the work that I've done, whatever it is, it's not complicated work. It's just taking time and simple work to like acknowledge and introduce and to listen. That actually has created healing backwards for my ancestors. I don't know if it's, healed everything, but it's just like, yeah. And I know you had mentioned that too. And I was just so excited that you believe that too. It was like, and I'm sure lots of your listeners do too. It's like, we have this incredible capacity and power in this lifetime to create mending for our ancestors.
Yeah, I don't think I could go on if I didn't think healing was possible, And there definitely are moments like when I am all up in my trauma where I'm like, healing, whatever. That's not gonna say,
Oh, of
like,
course, yeah.
But like, really,
that's just real. Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I do believe that. I think that like I can see it, right? As a parent, I can see it. Like I can see where I came from, and I can see like what's coming after me, and I know the interruptions that I've created, and I know the interventions that I've done, and the rituals, and like all this stuff, and I can see it in my kids. I can definitely see the impact. And like I love this idea that some wounds take more than one generation to heal, right?
Yeah.
And like, I think that there's such a thanks for being someone who's willing to embody all of those energies and being like, okay, cool, y'all can come heal in my body, and like I'll just be the container for that while y'all work it out. Like it's beautiful cultural work, right?
Mm.
So thanks. Naomi, I want to ask you one more question before we finish up, because you talk a lot about elders.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the pre-ancestors, right? And definitely in some cultures, like elders and ancestors, there's kind of like a blurring of those distinctions. And I personally have felt impacted by the way that the elders that I have are amazing, and there's not that there's not always been such a welcome in community for older folks, and at least in some of the communities that I've been in. Like, people age out of communities, of activist communities sometimes.
Yeah.
And so then we're just like, recreating the same struggles again and again without the benefit of like, oh yeah, there are these like wiser folks who have been through these things who could help us, do some of this work, so we don't have to just keep doing that. And I just wonder if you would speak to eldership and your view on it.
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions, or I might say the question that stayed with me all the way through the process of writing the book. So when I started writing Sustaining Spirit, it was a big shift. Like, I kind of went from like, I'm just going to interview a bunch of people, collect wisdom, and then it's going to be awesome and like share that. And then it transformed really into like a totally different kind of project. And through that process of interviewing a bunch of people, I was able to interview quite a few elders and about their experience. And one of the questions I had was like, how do people keep showing up? This work is kind of emotionally brutal. There's like these ebbs and flows. There's like these gains made and lost. And, it's like this continual transition. It's being in continual change, which is super unnerving. And so how do people actually navigate that? Like, how do folks who have stayed, keep coming up for the long haul? And so, what was really great is one, just interviewing elders who are such people, like we all are. I was able to really just sort of sit and witness folks that have been able to show up for the long haul, but they're humans. They have their gifts, they have their faults, they have things that I disagree with, and they have like this historical knowledge that sometimes fits with what we think about now about especially certain topics, and then not. And there's all that tension that's there. But really, like, when I was talking to folks, I was really interested in trying to kind of glean out how they hung in. How did people continue to show up in this work that's sometimes awfully brutal to our spirits, that have this ebb and flow to it, the work that, things get better and then things can get worse, and, communities come together and communities fall apart. And, it's like, how do you weather that? And so some of the things that, I found that were incredibly interesting was, the elders I interviewed had some commonalities, and I can just read some of those commonalities from the book. And I talk and share stories from specific people more in depth. But some of the similarities that I noticed from elders is that they demonstrate a willingness to show up for themselves and others, along with a constant curiosity about ideas, people, and possibilities. And that's one of the key things I really saw from elders, was kind of this like embodiment of curiosity, and not thinking that they had all the answers, but also making sure that they knew that you knew that you didn't have all the answers either. And sort of just being in kind of constant conversation and in the questions together, and an acknowledgement of not having everything figured out. They also took space to be really vulnerable, to share their voice and vision. And that's something I thought was kind of incredible. This actually isn't in the book, but one of the first times I met a disability community elder, his name was Justin Dart. I had the privilege of going to this like youth conference when I was younger. It was the first time I met it was really the first time I was in disability community and met a bunch of other disabled folks. But this older guy came on the stage, pushed, he was using a wheelchair. His partner was pushing him onto the stage. And he's talking to a bunch of young people. We're cool. We're teens. We we think we are like awesome. We're sitting there. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I love you. I love you." And I remember looking around at like the other young people being like, who is this white dude on the stage telling us that he loves us? It was just so uncomfortable. Wow. I was so uncomfortable. And now, like looking back on it as an adult, I'm like, that was probably one of the more powerful experiences I've ever had with an elder, because it's like there was somebody brave enough to get on the stage and just tell this group of young people that they love them. I mean, how incredible is that? So that kind of openness and vulnerability is really, really something I saw in a lot of elders. So I think that those are a few commonalities, and there's definitely more in the book about eldership and kind of stories about how what I've experienced from elders and the relationships.
Just finally, how are you hoping to be as a elder/ancestor?
I'm really hoping to be open and curious, and I don't know, something I feel like even now, I just feel in awe. Like I am in awe of the organizing and the passion and the love and devotion that folks are showing up with all over the country. I mean, I think that there's like this different experience when you don't live on the coasts, like for all of us in the middle, there's a lot more isolation and also a lot more intensity, because we're often, like, especially here on the border, we're dealing with stuff every day in our face. And so I hope to continue to be in that awe and in that, just like willing to not have the answers, but to show up with the questions. That's my hope for myself, that I continue to be in that place.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It's been such a lovely time with you here on Bespoken Bones. I'm so grateful for your time and your service, and not just this hour that we've spent together, but really your life's work. Really grateful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And folks can find out more about Naomi's work on your website, which I'm going to spell again, which is NaomiOrtiz.com, NaomiOrtiz.com. And so just thanks so much for being here, Naomi.
Thank you.
And wanting to thank other folks for listening to this episode. And, I'd love to hear from you. If you feel inspired by what you've heard, you can go to trancestralhealing.com. I offer sexual and ancestral wellness work, and you can learn more about it there. And love to hear your suggestions for the show. So reach out. I'm here, and I'm Pavini Moray, and I'll be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.